All right.
Welcome, everybody. Um, as you heard, we are going to record this lecture and then also post it online for access, for people that could not join us tonight. So welcome. Thanks for joining us today. We are excited that you're here. My name is Barbara Berthold, and I'm on the faculty of the Department of Modern Languages at UT Arlington. I'm also a board member of the German Texan Heritage Society. And together with the Dallas Goethe Center, we are hosting tonight's lecture. We all share a passion for language, culture, preservation of heritage and history, and especially when it comes to the diverse makeup of Texas. And the German element that we are centering today is, of course, one that's very dear to my heart. And I would allow me to introduce tonight's speaker, Dr. James Kearney, a scholar and a teacher, a role model in many ways. Dr. Kearney graduated from the University of Texas with a dual bachelor's degree in history and German, and later a PhD. He has taught German at Katy High School for several years and later an upper division course on European immigration to Texas in the 19th century at UT. In 2016, Dr. Kearney was inducted in the Texas Institute of Letters, honored by his peers for his literary achievements. Dr. Kearney's list of publication is long. Allow me to name a few. Nassau Plantation, The Evolution of a Texas German Slave Plantation, published in 2009. Friedrichsburg, The Colony of the German Fürstenverein, published in 2011. Detlef Dunn's Travels to Texas in 1834, published in 2015. And The 48ers on Possum Creek, a Texas Civil War story, published in 2020. Dr. Kearney also contributed a chapter on European immigration in Texas in the 19th century to a college textbook titled Discovering Texas History, which I personally use a lot. Tonight, we get to hear Dr. Kearney present about new frontiers in German Texan scholarship. Please help me welcome Dr. Kearney. Jim, thanks so much for being with us tonight.
Yeah, you can leave off the doctor. Yeah, it's great to be here. And this is kind of a culmination, not only for me, but for J.T. Kearney, who I see as uh, in because this has kind of been a joint work. And I need to say right off the bat a word about our this situation, our relationship here. JT, I'm going to speak tonight about a memoir by Heinrich von Struve. And Heinrich von Struve is J.T. Kearney's great grandfather. And he brought this memoir to my attention a few years back and asked me to do a new translation. I say a new translation because it's actually has been translated by within the family in a very limited, but for various reasons I don't want to go into, the translation was inadequate. The main reason was it was simply not annotated and had no discussion or anything, but there were also problems with the translation. So I agreed to do it, and so the book is now finished and has been accepted for publication by Texas A&M Press, and will be out maybe in the fall of next year if we're lucky. So I'm very excited about that. But once I accepted um, the um, the challenge, I've worked very closely with JT, and it's been a very close partnership. He's checked things along the way, but he also has provided an incredible amount of ancillary materials in the ways of photographs and documents, uh, and which will enhance the book markedly. So. Having said that, I'll launch right now into just a discussion about the book and what I see as its importance, which is very great. Um, Heinrich von Struve came from a very prominent family in Germany. He was of course aristocratic, but his parents, his father and his grandfather were also associated with with the Russian Foreign Service. So, in order to understand that, even though they were German, you have to wind the clock back to Peter the Great in Russia. And without giving a long explanation, he opened the door to the West and he recruited a lot of Germans to come into service into the Russian Foreign Service and other services as well. And that's how Heinrich von Struve's grandfather became a diplomat for the Russians, although he was very German. His father uh, continued that tradition, but Heinrich was raised in Germany because his father was a Russian diplomat to the Holy Roman Empire as long as it existed at Regensburg and at other places. So, as he says in the opening of his book, even though we have this association with Russia, I'm very German. So, but um, to understand the book, you have to understand this connection because a good half of the book is about his life in Eastern Europe, and this is especially in what was called Poland. Okay, so the book is important because Heinrich and his brother Gustav, about whom the book has a lot to say, were both 48ers. So this is a book about a 48er's odyssey in both the old world and the new. And it's important because it is a two-continent story. It's not just about his life in Texas, but it is about his life in Europe and the situation associated with the 48 revolution that caused him to immigrate. And I'll have more to say about how he differed from his brother Gustav later on. But now just a word about the organization of the book itself. Um, The book came out in about 1894, the first edition, and it had 21 chapters in the book. 12 of those chapters dealt with his life in Texas, and the rest dealt with the bulk of the rest dealt with his life in Europe. But it's mostly about his life in Texas. But the book was very popular and went through two more editions, three editions in total. And in the second edition, which was published in 1896, when Heinrich was 84 years old, he added another 17 chapters. And these chapters deal the bulk of these chapters actually deal with his life in Europe, and they fill in a lot of the details of that life. So you can read the book selectively, actually. If you're just interested in the Texas side of the story, you can pick out those chapters. But both JT and I find that the other chapters complement very nicely the story and fill in the details, and you really can't get the true picture unless you read them all. So that was how the book was published. So he starts off by he uses a very interesting phrase, which I kind of use as a leitmotif for the book. He speaks of carrying his bones to market. Now, that's a phrase that comes from the Bible, but it means having to make a complete, clean, fresh start in life. Um, and he had to carry his bones to market on two continents three times in his life. And that's kind of the backbone of the book. Now, what was the first time he carried his bones to market? Well, he came from a very large family. He had many brothers and sisters, and unlike some of his brothers who were actually absolute prime scholars, he was not so intellectual as them. So his father struggled to point him in the right direction and find him a career in life. But they eventually decided that he needed to be a military officer. And through his family connections, they got him a position in an cavalry unit, artillery unit in the Russian army in Congress, Poland. You have to remember, in the 1830s, Poland is divided between Prussia, Russia, and Austria. So he starts a career as an officer in the Russian army in Poland. But he didn't really like this. And just before um, the um, the revolution in Poland in 1832, when the Polish patriots revolted against Russia, he actually resigned, luckily, from the army and decided that that just wasn't his cup of tea. And so he went back and studied agriculture. And through this connection, he ended up buying a large estate in Congress Poland or Russian Poland with serfs. And he begins building up this estate and whipping it into order. And in the process, he learns both Russian and Polish, becomes fluent in the languages, and everything is doing very well until 1848 when the revolution breaks out. And Russia is very paranoid about revolutions and revolts, and because they'd already experienced one in 1832 in Poland, which they crushed eventually. But they were aware that Heinrich's brother Gustav was one of the leading agitators in Germany for democratic reforms. In fact, Gustav von Struve, actually Gustav Struve, because he dropped the fund, the aristocratic fund, was one of the leaders of the Baden insurrection in 1848, along with Friedrich Hecker. He actually led a militia force and participated in pitched battles with the Baden. So he was one of the leading insurrectionists in Germany in 1848. And the Russians, being aware of this, were very afraid of Heinrich, and they confiscated his estate, and he lost everything. He had to flee with his family in the dead of night across the river that separated Prussian Poland from Russian Poland, and he lost everything. So he had to bring his bones to market once again. And this time he decided to immigrate to the United States and start anew, and moreover, to immigrate to Texas. Why Texas? Well, because land. There's lots of land, and he had studied agriculture. He had experience in agriculture. So that's where he came in 1848, and he went to Fayette County, which is the neighboring county to where I live, halfway between Columbus and Austin on the Colorado River. And he bought a farm where the Fayette power plant, or very close to where the Fayette power plant is now located. And Texas, that part of Texas at that time was not frontier, but it was quasi-frontier, and life was very primitive. The roads were abysmal. There was only really a market, a barter economy. Very little money was in circulation. And he went from a situation where he had serfs, which is almost a form of slavery in Poland, to having to, he and his sons having to do all the backbreaking work of plowing and setting up a farm from scratch. So he lived on that farm from 1848 till nearly 1860. And so that is the story, the bulk of the story of the first edition tells that story. Now, within that story, there are wonderful little anecdotes that are absolutely delightful to read about. He tells the story of beginning a life as a new farm, on a farm in Fayette County, and how difficult the transition was from coming from a very privileged background, and especially for his wife, to living in a log cabin and traveling around in ox carts. But he also tells the story of starting a business as a freighter and all the adventures he had as a freighter, and he was seriously injured at one point, and he tells a very touching story of how all his neighbors, his Anglo neighbors, including John, no, I'm drawing a blank. Um, well, it was a very famous Texan was his neighbor, and they came to his
Baylor.
help. Yeah, yeah. Go ahead, JT.
I was just going to say it was Baylor.
Yeah. Right. And then, so that's a very nice story. And then he tells the story of attending a Methodist camp meeting. I thought, for me personally, this was a very uh, interesting story because the Methodist Academy was at Rudersville then, which is actually the first institution of higher learning in the Republic and in the state of Texas. And he was invited to one of these camp meetings. The Methodists were very active in the so-called Second Awakening, and they were also very active in the most successful group to proselytize Germans in Texas. Um, so he gets invited to one of these, and he really doesn't like it. The gravitas of a German service, of a Lutheran service with Bach, and then this sort of open emotionalism. He doesn't like it, but it's a very fun read, about his observations about it. Then he actually he tells another story about reaching out to other educated Germans, 48ers, Latiner, freethinkers, whatever you wish to call them. And in particular, he begins attending the annual meeting at Blackjack Springs. Now, Blackjack Springs is not generally known as one of the Latiner communities, but it was actually quite important because the Reverend Adolf Fuchs had settled there, and also the most prominent Texas German poet, Johannes Romberg, had settled there too. And every year they had a little festival where they did cultural things as well as just visiting and having lots of good food. And so it's interesting that this man who came from privileged circumstances and was educated, ended up connecting with other educated Germans in Fayette County. And by the way, Fayette County had a substantial German population already by 1848, and eventually it became majority German, judging from surnames, and pretty much remains so to this day. Um, so the book is not only a study of relationships between the dominant Anglo community, but it's also a study of intra-German relationships, of the class relationships and the class distinctions and the class what shall we say, frictions that existed even in Texas that were sort of carried over from German. And that's a fascinating component. Now, another side story that he tells that is quite interesting is the story of participating in an experiment in socialism in Texas in the 1850s. You might be aware of the name of Victor Considerant, the French socialist who actually attempted to set up a very big socialist experiment in North Texas, which failed. But at this point, Heinrich has made contact with the von Rosenberg family, who settled just to the north of him on Nassau Plantation. And I've written about this in my book. And JT, by the way, is also kin to the von Rosenberg side of the family. But Axel Meerscheidt, not Axel, but Arthur Meerscheidt, married into the family, and he was quite unhappy on a lot of scores, but he somehow joined forces with Heinrich to set up a socialist commune. These farmers wanted to pool their resources and do everything collectively and live together and divide up the labor. And they thought they could had a better chance of getting ahead doing that. And they were very much using Victor Considerant's ideas as their touchstone and guidebook for doing this. The the adventure didn't succeed, but it is a very interesting idea because it fits into a pattern of quite a few of these communes being established, and very often German Texans were involved in this. The story, it is also the story then of going bust in the terrible drought of 1858, 59, and 60. Texas has experienced many droughts over the years, and they seem to be periodic. And it was actually a German, Jakob Küchler, who first noted this by studying tree rings in the hill country as a result of the 58 drought. And he went all the way back to 1725 and showed that droughts are a recurring phenomenon in Texas. And by the way, his study, which was published in the Texas Almanac in 1860, was the first published scientific study of tree rings. So Jakob Küchler is the father of the science of dendrochronology. But anyway, the drought was statewide, and it ruined Heinrich von Struve. He went bankrupt essentially, and he decided then to go back to Germany. He left, however. His two grown sons stayed behind. Ludwig and Anton was the other one.
Amon.
Yeah, Armand. Yeah, Armand and Ludwig. And JT is the descendant of Ludwig, right?
Correct.
Yeah. And so they decided to make their lives in Texas. So the story is the difficulty of actually, making a go in Texas. But once they get back to Germany, it also becomes evident that his wife had really had a hard time adjusting to the primitive situations in Texas. And she, in fact, had to be institutionalized in a special institution in Germany because it had been such a stress on her. Now, I have mentioned that this book is actually, in many ways, a story of two brothers, Heinrich and Gustav, and their contrasting stories, and the contrasting way in which they both their lives were changed by the 48 Revolution. And at this point, I want to mention a particular chapter in the book where the circle comes full swing between these two brothers, and the fact that Heinrich had a kind of love-hate relationship with his older brother. I mean, he really admired him on the one hand, and his idealism, which was uncompromising, his 48er ideals. But on the other hand, he didn't agree with everything that he said. But he nonetheless dedicated the book to him, and he has two chapters dedicated to him. Or he has one chapter dedicated to him in particular, but another one which is very much has to do with Gustav, and that's what I want to say a few words about now. One of the chapters in the book is called The Dutch N-word. So I won't say the N-word, but you know what I'm talking about. And Dutch, of course, it was the universal word for a German in Texas at the time. You were a Dutchman. That meant you were German. So this is a story about a German orphan girl who was orphaned on the beaches of Indianola in the terrible plagues of 1846 or the pandemic, and was picked up and raised by Anglos as a slave. They and then Heinrich, just as he's preparing to leave Texas, he's already his daughters and his wife have already gone back, and he's getting everything in order. And he's riding a stagecoach between LaGrange and Galveston. And a guy gets on the stagecoach who's got obviously a white girl with her. And the guy then tries to peddle her as a slave to those in the stagecoach. And Heinrich becomes enraged, and they almost have a shootout in the deal in the stagecoach. But and by the way, this is a story that's been repeated several times. And there's a book about a German girl who was raised as a slave in New Orleans, and the German author Struberg, also in his book Alte und Neue Heimat, tells the same sort of story about German orphan girls raised as slaves. So it's an interesting motif that appears several times. But anyway, Heinrich then has to go on back to, makes his way back to Germany, but he stops to visit his brother Gustav, who lives in Long Island. In fact, a lot of 48ers settled in New York, and in Bellamont, Belleville, Illinois was another destination, as well as Texas became a primary location for many 48ers. So and of course, his brother is a dyed-in-the-wool 48er who has transferred his idealism from the situation in Germany to the situation in the United States. And the great fly in the ointment is slavery. And he's becoming a radical abolitionist, as many of the 48ers did. And he is very much trying to get his fellow Germans in New York to switch their vote from the Democratic to the Republican ticket. Because the majority of Germans are tending to vote Democrat at this point, even in the North. So Heinrich tells him this story about this, and Gustav, you know, his eyes brighten, and he says, we must write that story up. We must write that story up and give it to the German newspapers. And that will inflame the Germans in New York to vote for Lincoln in the 1860 election. So that's what they did. They wrote the story up, and they claim it was published in the Kriminalzeitung, which was a major newspaper, German language newspaper in New York. And according to his account, the article was then picked up by other German language newspapers and English language newspapers across the North. And of course, in the election of 1860, New York and Pennsylvania were pivotal in the election because those two states had almost as many winner-take-all electoral votes as all the other states put together. And the Germans did switch their vote from Democrat to Republican in the 1860 election, and they carried the election. So Heinrich won the election for Lincoln and Gustav. Well, not really, but they had an effect. And so this underscores really the important role of the 48ers in American politics, starting with the 1860 election. That is when the Germans came out of the closet for the first time in American politics and asserted themselves in a meaningful way. And the 48ers led the way. And so this particular story absolutely hones in on the 1860 election, and these two brothers played a role. Now, whether they won the election for Lincoln, well, probably not, but still, they had an effect. And that gives the book an importance that goes beyond the Texas story, you see. That's what I'm trying to say. Okay, I'm going to wind it up so people can, well, it's still, I've only gone 30 minutes, but I I want to open it up for discussion and for people to have time to ask questions. But my conclusion is that this is an important book on a lot of fronts. Of course, for the family, for JT and his family, it's a wonderful window into their ancestors' own lives, a very dramatic story on both sides of the Atlantic. And but for us, for the rest of us, it is really a most fascinating odyssey of about two 48ers, different paths, and how they the situation in Europe led them to immigrate to the United States, and how they then impacted in positive ways their new country, you know. But as a whole, they are illustrative or emblematic, maybe is a better word, of the absolutely important role that 48ers played in American life. And I like the fact that the book is gives the European side of the story as well as the Texas side of the story, because you really, through these various anecdotes and stories, many of which are sort of self-contained, you find yourself getting a really nice picture of how complicated the situation was in Europe and how it affected people's lives at a grassroots level. And, you know, the exact number of 48ers who came over is, I don't think has ever been quantified, but it was in the tens of thousands probably. And, and they went to other places in the world, but the great bulk of them came to the United States who managed to escape, you know. So, and they not only had a positive effect, in my opinion, on the country as a whole, but they also had a positive effect on Texas in many ways. Many of the progressive ideas that, such as they are in Texas, if you trace them back, they very often have their roots in the Latiner communities in Texas. And I think all this is even more poignant now that we have an election year, and a very crucial election, just like the 1860 election. I won't say any more about politics, but anyway, it gives cause for reflection about all that sort of thing. So with that, I think it's it's going to be a very nice book, and it's been a wonderful collaboration with JT, and we look forward, and we're very excited that A&M Press has decided to accept it for publication. And so with that, I'll conclude and just take questions and we'll
So,
have a discussion.
hey, Jim,